Geert. We have a question that we would like to discuss, which is one of the questions that was submitted by one of the students.
Yeah.
And it is a question related to the maximum allowable pressure.
Yeah.
The question states, how is maximum allowable pressure, PS, defined according to the PED? And in order to illustrate this a little bit, let me just share my screen. I've opened the Pressure Equipment Directive, Article 1, Scope, and here it states, that the maximum allowable pressure should be below half a bar.
Yeah.
Um,
Correct. Yeah.
and I remember, when I was a young engineer, first encountered the PED, the term maximum allowable pressure was confusing to me as well, and hence we also received questions related to this term.
Yeah.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on what the maximum allowable pressure, PS, actually is, and how it relates to, for example, the design pressure, the operating pressure, and even, a term like the maximum allowable working pressure?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the maximum allowable pressure, which has been defined in the Pressure Equipment Directive, it is a pressure that is defined by the manufacturer of the pressure equipment.
All right.
And it can be, depending on what the manufacturer says, he has some options. One of the options is that if the pressure equipment has a safety device, the maximum allowable pressure will be defined as the pressure which is the safety valve opening pressure. So
Right.
that's one definition of what a maximum allowable pressure is. Second option is that if there is no safety device, for instance, you can have a pressure vessel with water in it, and it's only for that it contains water. So at the surface of the water there is no pressure. In that case, the manufacturer can state that the maximum allowable pressure is on the top of the vessel. So there is 0 bar as a maximum allowable pressure.
All right.
In the meantime, of course, because there's water in that vessel,
Yeah.
and suppose this is a vessel which has a height of 10 meters, then at the bottom of the vessel you will have a pressure of 1 bar. This is
Exactly.
called
Yeah.
the calculation pressure.
Yeah. So that is like that is including the hydrostatic pressure.
Yes,
That
that's right.
1 bar.
There
Yeah.
is a water column, and it means, of course, that you have to design this vessel at the bottom for 1 bar.
Yeah.
And at the top you have 0 bar. So it's quite confusing, because you think that the maximum allowable pressure is the highest pressure that you can have in your pressure vessel or your pressure equipment. But
Right.
that is not the case. It's based on the definition of the manufacturer. And in the
Okay.
case,
So
in the case there is a 0 bar at the top, and it's defined as the maximum allowable pressure, this equipment will not be under the Pressure Equipment Directive.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if I understand you correctly, the manufacturer of the equipment states the maximum allowable pressure, often related to the location and the settings of safety devices.
Yeah,
But that maximum allowable pressure is not the maximum pressure in the system.
that's correct.
Uh, and you just mentioned the calculation pressure, and this calculation pressure, which is another term, is dependent on the location where you
Yeah,
are doing your
that's right.
calculations in the system. Is
I
that
just
right?
mentioned that there is a water column, for instance, but you can also have a very complex systems. Uh, for instance, an HRSG, heat recovery steam generator, consisting of an economizer, an evaporator, and a superheater. That there will be resistance in your pipelines meaning that, for instance, in an economizer, you can have um, a calculation pressure which is higher than the pressure in the evaporator system.
Yeah.
And in this evaporator system, in lots of cases you have a steam drum which is on top of the installation with a height of about 20 meters.
Right.
And then you have some resistance in your pipelines from the economizer to the evaporator. Um, so the calculation pressure in the economizer can be higher than the pressure on top of the steam drum.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, you also can have water column in the economizer, meaning that at the bottom of the economizer, um, for instance, if it's a height of 20 meters, the calculation pressure will be again um, 2 bar higher than at the top of the economizer, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have this calculation pressure, the term calculation pressure, which it varies through the system depending
Yeah,
on amongst others height and friction in the system,
yeah,
and this calculation pressure can either be higher or lower than the maximum allowable pressure as the manufacturer of the entire system or either the different
yeah,
equipments has specified
yeah.
it. Yeah.
That's
All
correct.
right. So Geert, how does this relate to a term that many people are very used to, the design pressure, for example, on a technical drawing?
Yeah. Now, well, the design pressure, it's dependent on the code that you are using. For instance, in the PED,
Okay.
which is of course not a design code, but it's legislation. It's a directive.
Yeah.
Um, and well, if you use this PED, they're talking about design pressure, meaning the maximum allowable pressure, which I just explained.
Yeah.
The confusion is, of course, that other design codes, if you look, for instance, for the ESME design code, ESME 1 for boilers or the ESME 8 Division 1 for unfired pressure vessels,
Yeah.
they use um, the term design pressure as the calculation pressure. So it
All right.
really is confusing, but you have to look into the code that you are using to know what the definition of a design pressure or a calculation pressure or a maximum allowable working pressure, which is also from the ESME. Maximum allowable working pressure is actually the same as what is stated in the PED as the maximum allowable pressure
All right. For the ESME codes.
for the ESME code. Yes.
Yeah. So if I understand it correctly, I mean this is pretty confusing indeed. That
Yeah.
the term design pressure, for example, in EN codes, so codes harmonized with the PED, means something different potentially from design standards and codes according to the ASME. So if
Yeah.
I summarize what you just said, um, the term design pressure in the EN codes is often linked to maximum allowable pressure,
Yeah.
um, as defined in the PED. But if you use the term design pressure according to the ASME codes, it is related to the definition of the calculation pressure.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
All right, all right, okay. Um, well, thanks for uh, explaining this to us and having a little bit of a discussion about this question.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, let's reconnect soon for another question, Geert.
Okay. You're welcome, Luke.